In Ethiopia's Ejarsagoro neighborhood near Harar, a boy was born on July 23, 1892, who would later become known as Emperor Haile Selassie I. His father named him Lineage Tafari Makonnen. In Ethiopian culture, lineage means son of, and Tafari indicates someone to be respected or feared, while Makonnen was his family name. Even as a child, people called him the son of Makonnen, the most respected of all. Tafari was born into a noble and aristocratic family with close ties to the Ethiopian imperial line. His relative, Ras Makonnen, was the governor of Harar, a fortified town in eastern Ethiopia. Emperor Menelik II, another relative, ruled the empire at the time. Tafari's upbringing was surrounded by culture, prestige, and a deep connection to the imperial family. Socially, Tafari's maternal lineage traces back to the Solomonic emperors, who ruled this part of Africa by the 13th century. Tafari's mother was Waziri Yeshimebet Ali. She hailed from Wollo, a region in northern Ethiopia, and her father was a powerful warlord. In any attempt to investigate the life of Tafari, understanding Ethiopian society and the empire that dominated it by the end of the 19th century is imperative. There is a different history in the country of Ethiopia and the region of the Horn of Africa as a whole. When North Africa was ruled by the Roman Empire, Roman Egypt became one of the first centers of Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean, over 1,700 years ago. The new religion spread southwards, around the Red Sea and the Nile River, much faster than the reach of the Roman Empire's borders and politics. A large number of Christians began to settle in present-day Ethiopia, which later contributed to the entire country's conversion to Christianity. In the 7th century CE, the Middle Eastern and North African Arab conquests practically isolated Ethiopia from the rest of the Christian world, as it remained unassimilated into Islam. Therefore, through the ages, Ethiopia formed a specific type of Christianity that retained many of the features of the Church in the 4th century. Revolutionary ethno-nationalism in Ethiopia cannot be understood without Indian influences in establishing the concept of a divine empire. The monarchs of the Kingdom of Ethiopia began to assert, from the 13th century, that they were descendants of King Solomon. This is the reason why the family dynasty was referred to as the Solomonic royalty. The Solomonic dynasty ruled over a kingdom which smaller in size compared to the highlands of northern Ethiopia, not more than a couple of centuries. Nevertheless, the empire started eastward, westward, and southward expansion between the 13th and 19th centuries, and eventually it settled in the present-day Ethiopia. The Solomonic dynasty ruled over a kingdom which smaller in size compared to the highlands of northern Ethiopia, not more than a couple of centuries. Nevertheless, the empire started eastward, westward, and southward expansion between the 13th and 19th centuries, and eventually it settled in the present-day Ethiopia. The making of the Ethiopian empire transformed it into a multi-ethnic empire, whereby the emperors ruled over different ethnicities. The Amharas and Oromos made up over 50% of the population of the empire, while Somalis in the far south and east, and Tigrayans in the northeast, formed other key minority groups. These distinct ethnicities had different languages and physical appearances. It is important to note that the Oromo, a population belonging to the Cushitic ethnic group dominant in the northwest of the country, was relatively more receptive to the introduction of Islam in the area. The Amhara, a Semitic people, resided in the highlands of Ethiopia and were more fanatically attached to Oriental Orthodox Christianity. These ethnic and theological divides would govern the whole history of modern Ethiopia and that of Haile Selassie. At the time when R.S. Tafari made his appearance, the empire of Ethiopia was known rather differently. Foreigners, who often favored mixed-race peoples, used the term Habashan Empire, derived from the Arabic word abasha, meaning to mix, to refer to Ethiopia due to its multiracial composition. This proves how central these ethnicities are to the nation's story. By the mid-1800s, the Ethiopian Empire had grown and matured into one of the strongest empires in Africa. It was different because the principal powers of Europe were just about to embark on a full-scale colonization of the territory. The British had almost made Egypt a crown colony and threatened to push their administration even south of the Nile into the western part of Ethiopia, called Sudan, and then later into Uganda and Kenya, which lay south of Abyssinia. In the years directly prior to the birth of Ras Tafari, a few select nations of Europe had successfully snatched territory through both diplomatic machinations and military might along the eastern seaboard of the Horn of Africa to the east of Abyssinia. Foremost among these countries was Italy, which in the late 1880s annexed Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, territories which occupied most of the present-day Eritrea and Somalia, respectively. Little colonies were likewise built by the British and French in the extreme north of Somaliland. In the end, the European countries fell into what is commonly referred to as the scramble for Africa and annexed almost the whole of Africa. However, thanks to Emperor Menelik II's modernization campaign launched in 1889, which brought many great changes to the Ethiopian Empire, formerly known as Abyssinia, this was not the case for Ethiopia. Some years later, Emperor Menelik II, allied with the Russian Empire, which he had engaged in 1893, and undertook the building of Addis Ababa, which was to become an impressive capital at the heart of the empire. The Russians sent a range of personnel, including economists, scientists, and military advisors, to modernize the administration, economy, and army of Abyssinia, so as to keep off aggressors such as the Italians, English, French, and others. Thereafter, in the proper chronology of Ethiopian history, a new era began with the arrival of Tafari in 1892. This marked the beginning of Tafari, son of one of the blessed Ethiopian noble families, who was recognized from a young age. An instance of this acknowledgement was when he was awarded the title of Dejazmach of Gara Mulata, a region adjacent to Harar, at an age of mere 13 years. The moniker, which is literally translated as "on who keeps the door," simply meant that he had already started the work of protecting the area, even in his teenage years. Most likely due to the fact that he belonged to the imperial dynasty, many people wouldn't expect any rise in status concerning the responsibilities of a future emperor, since Menelik II was known to have a very clear plan of succession. He had two daughters, Zewditu and Shorega. In the end, Lij Iyasu, the son of Shorega, was chosen to be the heir to Menelik's throne. The youth of Tafari witnessed the unholy and determined ambition of the Kingdom of Italy to annex Abyssinia after successfully combining its two colonies, Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. The Italians invaded Abyssinia in 1895, but it was too late for them. The policies of Emperor Menelik had already begun to bear fruit. The First Italian-Ethiopian War concluded in 1896 with Highland Ethiopia, boasting an army of about 75,000, successfully crushing the Italian contingent of about 15,000 men at the Battle of Adwa. As a result of this win, Abyssinia was able to maintain its independence for the next 10 years. During his adolescence, Tafari kept advancing within the empire. For instance, in 1907 he became the governor of Sidamo province in southern Ethiopia. At this time he had a daughter named Princess Romanwork, though the identity of the mother remained a mystery. In 1911, Tafari married another member of the imperial family, Menen Asfaw. This was also at the time when the 70-year-old Emperor Menelik II, who had become incapacitated due to several strokes, was approaching his 100th birthday. Lij Iyasu, the grandson aged 18, became the emperor-designate after the death of his father in 1913. By 1913, owing to the ill health of his grandfather, Iyasu assumed the position of emperor in all but title. In fact, it may have prepared him well to take the place of the emperor, who was in such grave health, but the situation was the reverse. The last remnants of Iyasu were opposed by the Council of Ministers, which included his grandfather, as well as his aunt, Princess Zewditu, the younger child of Menelik. Consequently, in the closing years of Menelik, the crown princess and the Council of Elders managed to overlook the death of Menelik in December 1913 and rejected Iyasu as the successor heir. For the next few months, he enjoyed the feeling of power. However, no announcement of his coronation would be made, and he was never given an imperial title. There were various reasons for this contradiction towards Ieyasu. First of all, during the last years of Menelik's reign, the young prince had shown a remarkable reluctance to control and direct the affairs of a rapidly modernizing empire, which was expected of the foremost figure. Secondly, doubts were expressed about his possible pro-Islam stance, in contrast to the orthodox Christian politics of Ethiopia. The latter concern was intolerable for the Council of Ministers, and in the autumn of 1916 they moved to depose Ieyasu from his position as emperor, amid rising suspicions of his Islamist leanings. Until the mid-1930s, he was to be held in solitary confinement until his death. Upon his overthrow, Zewditu was proclaimed Empress of Ethiopia. While it was not clear who was to succeed her, but there was a consensus that her cousin, lineage Tafari Makonnen, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, would assume the regency and the throne. In the late 1900s to early 1910s, Tafari appeared to have enjoyed a successful period as a regional governor in charge of several provinces, and he seemed to have thrived during the power struggles of Ieyasu's short reign. Zewditu, being nearly 40 and with no clearly apparent successor, made it possible for Tafari to later take the throne. Gradually, the institutions of the Abyssinian state began to show an increasing separation between Empress Zewditu and Regent Tafari. She was a traditionalist and therefore a reactionary ruler, while he was on the path to modernization based on the legacy of Emperor Menelik II. Theoretically, the empress could be said to hold the potential to exercise power which would exceed that of all her predecessors. Still, she did not exercise any powers that were greater than any of her predecessors because she was a woman and ruled over a male-oriented society. It follows, then, that in countless such instances, Tafari was likely to be more influential than her position in the power relations of the time allowed. Each of them had their own faction. Most of the ministers supported Tafari, while Zewditu's opponents within the Ethiopian Church, which was more oriented towards her conservative beliefs, supported her. In time, he became the more powerful figure during the 1920s, due to Zewditu's gradual withdrawal from the political scene long before the end of her rule, which allowed Tafari to implement his program of modernization. Various strategies were executed in the 1920s. The principal aim was to upgrade the structures and systems of management existing in Ethiopia, especially in the Abyssinia region, to be like those in other European states. This had already been achieved in Japan, which, during the previous century, was the most progressive country among the non-European nations. Thanks to the implementation of Western strategies, the country was able to stave off the Western powers' influence, and by the 1920s, it exerted significant dominance in the Far East. Abyssinia wanted to achieve this to some degree. In this sense, Tafari endeavored to structure an administration with a flip side, which was the chief cabinet who performed the day-to-day executive work. At the same time, there was also a provision that the hierarchy governing Ethiopian affairs shifted away from the feudal system to one that was more centralized and favorable to personal merit over noble rank. Additionally, the founding of a military college further enhanced the army, which had been modernized during Menelik's regime. Finally, Abyssinia applied for membership in the League of Nations, which was to become the United Nations. It was in 1923 that she became a member of the League, of which she was among the few countries that were not European or American. The proposed economic and social changes to be brought about during Tafari's regency and Empress Zewditu's rule were far-reaching. In the middle of the 1910s, the first electric grids were set up in Addis Ababa, and by the 1920s, they were expanded all over the town. At the same time, work started on connecting the major cities with roads and later with railroad lines. Although communication with the Western world's telegraphic apparatus had become the norm by the end of the 1800s, Abyssinia once again faced such technology, albeit on a limited scale. The introduction of the National Bank of Ethiopia in 1927 prohibited usurious lending practices for the purpose of economic stabilization. Most importantly, the National Bank of Ethiopia completely overhauled the entire judicial system. The ancient canon law system of Fitha Negast, which dated back centuries in Ethiopia and was notoriously harsh, even against petty crimes such as holding a person's hand, was scrapped and replaced with a common civil law system, incorporating elements of both common and civil law. Conversely, there remained a lot of static society in Ethiopia. Here, 100 years after the institution had been abolished in most of the countries of the West, slavery was still practiced. Those Western nations that had been able to subdue that practice criticized the regime for its internal ethnic relations. However, in the 1920s, despite half-hearted attempts to abolish it, Abyssinia did not make any serious effort to end slavery. By the late 1920s, public perception had shifted, with Tafari becoming the representative of the country known as Abyssinia, and not the woman who was empress. Many changes occurred owing to the places visited by the member states within the context of the state activity. For example, in 1924, he and other members of the royal family were sent on official delegations to several foreign capitals and large cities. In reality, a great deal of this was an expeditionary drive as well, Tafari and the others wishing to see the Western societies they had endeavored to copy, at least to some degree. The members of the Abyssinian entourage were quite captivating in the way they showcased their wealth and court etiquette during visits, such as Tafari's trip to London, where he met King George V and Poincaré in Paris. Tafari participated in this international tour of propaganda with the intention of persuading the British and French governments to grant a Red Sea outlet to Abyssinia in exchange for part of their colonial territories in Somaliland. The Middle East and North Africa embraced him as the de facto leader of the only African country that had successfully fought off European colonial forces in the 19th century. All this contributed to ensuring Tafari's fame worldwide before he ascended to the throne. Even by 1928, the rise of Tafari within Abyssinia forced the empress to elevate him further. By this time, he had acquired all power within the Council of Ministers, but most importantly, he had begun to win over the chiefs of the military and police forces. Consequently, on the 7th day of October in the year 1928, he was bestowed with the rank of Negus, which is an Abyssinian rank that is greater than that of an emperor or empress, but less than that of a king. This status rendered his previous title of RAS, signifying rank in the imperial setting, obsolete. In January of the year 1930, a somewhat civil conflict occurred between Simeon Gugsa Well, who was married to the empress, and Tafari, who was the feud's apex occupant, as enmity had been sustained for some time between the apostle of the emperor eugenics and the empress's dominion herself. Tafari's husband did not only wish to restore his wife's former status in the empire, but he also wanted to overthrow Tafari and take over the throne himself. This insurrection led to a major clash of forces between the opponents of Gugsa Well and the allies of Tafari on the 31st of March 1930 at the Battle of Ankam. Nonetheless, the proponents for Tafari managed to turn the tables on Gugsa Well and his forces using sophisticated warfare tactics and modern warfare machineries, including aeroplanes. This, too, as many, became a victim of the war and was laid in rest. 2 days later, the emperor's death occurred after an illness of a strange nature, and which had nothing to do with politics, which gave room for Tafari to finally take over Abyssinia after his long struggle of power-sharing with the empress after the demise of Zewditu. Following the death of Empress Zewditu, a mourning period lasting over half a year began. On November 2, 1930, the new emperor of Abyssinia was crowned in the Cathedral of St. George in Addis Ababa, which was the first church built in the city in the year 1912. Many dignitaries and diplomats representing various Western nations graced the occasion, while in that year, around the month of November, Tafari made it to the cover page of the Time magazine. Moreover, he took on another name and another title. He became known as Haile Selassie and took the title Negusa Nagast, which means the King of Kings. This indicates that in the name Haile Selassie, the word Haile means power of, while Selassie means Trinity, hence the name means power of the Trinity. It should be pointed out, nevertheless, that Ras Tafari, the name used throughout much of the 1920s, would come back years later and become even more popular around the world. More significantly, following his ascension to the throne in 1931, the new emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, efficiently supervised the implementation of the first modern constitution of Ethiopia in the early 1930s. Thus, the emperor shared governance of a two-house legislative body composed of the House of Lords and the Parliament. Another purpose for the democratization of politics under the new constitution was to ensure that the legal regime, based on the Feta Nagast dispensation, was done away with and replaced by a more modern legal system. The fulfillment and expansion of the modernization program that he had initiated as regent back in the 1920s formed the basic premise of Selassie's early years in office as Emperor of Ethiopia. Nevertheless, a rather more troubling view of Ethiopia lurked in the background. After the fascist blackshirts trained 30,000 paramilitary troops to undertake the successful March on Rome in 1922, Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party surreptitiously gained control of the state of Italy. Revanchism's desire for past aspirations of losers, Mussolini tries to restore some past glory of the Roman Empire. For that purpose, several measures were taken in the 1920s, such as invading Corfu in the course of a war with Greece, occupying the Croatian city of Fiume, and sending forces into Albania. This was the first step towards incorporating the region located in modern-day Libya, which had officially been a colony of Italy since 1912, but was not actively governed. In the course of the 1920s, a number of compromises were made. After these achievements, in the early 1930s, Mussolini switched his focus increasingly towards the Horn of Africa, a region he perceived needed to be reclaimed from historical losses, specifically Italy's defeat to Ethiopia during the First Italo-Ethiopian War in the 1890s. Apart from wanting to fill the gap between Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia, which were already under the Italian Empire, the subjugation of Abyssinia would position Italy as the foremost colonial power in the entire Horn of Africa. In 1934, relations between Selassie's regime and Italian colonial rule in Eritrea and Somaliland became badly strained. This time, however, the underlying motive was Italy's perennial ambition to build a railway within the territory, joining its two separated colonies, which had Ethiopia sandwiched in between. To wrap this up, Italy constructed a military base in the eastern part of Ethiopia known as Wal Wal. The administration of Emperor Haile Selassie took issue with the presence of Italians in the region in December 1934 by sending Ethiopian forces to Wal Wal. Many casualties occurred on both sides as a result of fighting that took place on December 5th between them. This international contention was termed simply the Abyssinia Crisis. In the beginning of the year, during January 1935, the administration of Selassie appealed to the League of Nations on various matters of concern. After extended efforts in diplomacy, the British and French governments, then the most likely intermediaries, opted instead at the time to allow Italian expansionism, since they were already seeking Mussolini's collaboration in their plans against Hitler's Germany, which came to power in 1933 in Germany. Thus, after months of negotiations, it became apparent to Selassie's government that the League of Nations was not going to take any effective steps to stop the aggression of Benito Mussolini. It also became clear that the Italians had planned the Wal Wal altercation in December 1934 and the subsequent stalled diplomacy as grounds for an eventual declaration of war against Abyssinia. On October 3, 1935, thousands of Italian troops, led by General Emilio de Bono, invaded northern Ethiopia, an attack that escalated into the Second Italo-Abyssinian War. There was yet no formal declaration of war. Countless trained soldiers and personnel from both sides were engaged in one of the most extensive wars between the First and Second World Wars. The war was bound to last for more than 6 months. Such a situation, however, did not offer balance between the two sides. It is true that the Ethiopian forces attempted their level best to update their strategy since the beginning of the 1890s. Yet they were only able to field, in principle, what were referred to as mass infantry divisions armies, which were in theory adaptable, in practice so unrealistic. For example, the regime of Selassie possessed only a few tanks, while the myth of the Ethiopian Air Force boasted a little over a dozen planes. In contrast, the government of Mussolini was able within no time to deploy hundreds of tanks accompanied by heavy artillery and air forces throughout East Africa. As these overextended arguments of the Italian army would show in due course, this intervention into Europe was not aimed at the contemporary European theater of war. This war, which started in autumn of 1935, was, without fail, a battle of Goliath and David extremities, but this time Goliath completely obliterated David as opposed to the First Italo-Ethiopian War of 1895, where David won against Goliath. On October 7, 1935, 4 days after the invasion of Ethiopia by de Bono's troops, the League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy. This action came in response to the Italian invasion of Albania. The British and French, the preeminent colonial forces in Africa, had their spheres of influence in Somaliland, from where they expanded into southern as well as western Ethiopia, into Sudan and Kenya, respectively. Yet, despite the support given to Stanley Baldwin's leadership by the Conservatives in November 1935, the general election called for a firm stand to suppress all internal and external aggression. This meant supporting the League of Nations. However, Baldwin's government easily capitulated to Italy's imperialist designs. Shortly after taking office, the new British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare met French Prime Minister Pierre Laval for the purpose of discussing ways of resolving the conflict quickly, if at all possible. In this respect, the Hoare-Laval Pact, the elements of which the British press had already released as early as the beginning of December, practically schematized the idea that half of Abyssinia would be suggested to be given to Italy for the purpose of connecting her colonies, Eritrea and Somaliland. The purpose was to placate Italy and prevent it from moving any closer to Nazi Germany. This was viewed by Selassie's regime as outright disrespect to the Charter of the League of Nations and utterly unacceptable. Consequently, Hoare had to quit as the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, which was followed by the fallout over the terms of the disclosed pact, marking the end of all escalatory diplomatic efforts. It is notably understood that the Hoare-Laval Pact and the larger Abyssinia crisis both marked for many people the end of the League of Nations, which had already shown that it could not restrain countries such as Italy and the Japanese Empire, who were determined to invade other nations without any justification. The battle worsened in Abyssinia at the end of December 1935, when all diplomatic solutions to the conflict were exhausted. By this time, the Ethiopian government had noticed the advancing Italian forces in the north and had begun organizing a counteroffensive. Selassie has a clear mission of preventing the Italian reinforcements from penetrating the territory and launching a counteroffensive into Eritrea. He was initially able to accomplish the mission extremely well, but this already positive posture started to change quite sharply at the beginning of 1936, when General Pietro Badoglio, who had been appointed to the post of the High Commissioner of Eritrea and the commander of the troops, replacing de Bono, who proved to be overly restrained in respect to Mussolini's invasion ambitions, began influencing events. In January 1936, Badoglio initiated a brutal offensive against the Ethiopian army, using poison gas as a weapon. Employing such tactics, Badoglio achieved decisive victories in northern Ethiopian campaigns in late February and early March of 1936 in Tembien, Amba Aradam, and Shire. On March 31, 1936, the Battle of Mechu marked the collapse of Selassie's efforts to keep the northern front active, and thus northern Ethiopia came under Italian control. Conquering Ethiopia proved easy for Mussolini, as in June that same year, he initiated what he called the March of the Iron Will, a rapid advance from Dessie in Wollo province, about 200 kilometers from the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. A lot of enthusiasm and propaganda surrounded this undertaking, supported by the fascist media in Italy. The most important characteristic of this offensive was a large mechanized column of approximately 2,000 tanks, cars, trucks, and other vehicles. These vehicles quickly transported some 12,500 Italian soldiers towards the city of Selassie. By this time, the northern offensive had annihilated the Ethiopian armies. As early May drew near, and the Italians advanced on Addis Ababa, the Empress and her household vacated the capital and made their way towards the border of French Somaliland, since Selassie was already being exiled from his country for several years. On May 5, 1936, in the evening hours, Badoglio appeared in Addis Ababa, escorted by a procession of 1,700 vehicles. Thereafter, the Italian troops surrounded the city and began taking key areas of the capital. It was more pomp than a military siege. This signified the official end of the war. In considering the observed conduct of Emperor Haile Selassie at the Versailles Conference, as well as his first trip away from Ethiopia until the fall of Addis Ababa in May 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie fled due to loss in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Addis Ababa fell, yet there remained scattered centers of resistance, especially in the western and southern parts of the country where there were no Italian forces. As a result, fighting continued for several months, possibly even years. However, it is a fact that the Italians never truly held complete control over all of Abyssinia. Starting in May of 1936, it was proclaimed by the Italian officials that the conflict had ended and a victory had been achieved. Furthermore, the Italian Empire officially claimed ownership of Italian East Africa on May 9, 1936, when it was declared by Benito Mussolini. This region was effectively added to the Ethiopia declared by Mussolini, which included all of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, and also fully Abyssinia, which was all in the Horn of Africa, finally fulfilling the ambition of Italy which had remained in the dreams of many for years, that of forming a single big colony. Up to that point, the Italians had made an attempt to reach this geographic region about 39 years earlier, in the year of 1896, only to be rebuffed. It was the Italians who inflicted a colonial terror in the region, putting into use near genocidal techniques they had acquired in Libya in the 1920s. These included incarcerating hundreds of thousands in concentration camps and employing the create-then-destroy strategy, setting the different tribes of Ethiopia against each other. Emperor Selassie proceeded to Europe only after the Italians had reduced his people to almost minimal authority. He received an invitation to assume the position of Abyssinia's envoy to the League of Nations, which was situated in Geneva. The timing was, however, not the best. In the spring of 1936, German troops crossed the borders into the Rhineland, a demilitarized area, in clear contravention of the rules prohibiting the re-entry of German armed forces into that area. This followed Germany's remilitarization of Western Europe in 1935, saturating the area with arms and women soldiers ready for war. Military sanctions had been imposed on Germany after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles following the First World War. Consequently, neither of the two Western colonial powers, Britain or France, was more inclined than the previous autumn to confront Italian aggression vigorously. However, some of Selassie's cries for redress were met with thanks, especially as they were accompanied by his speech against fascism and the use of chemical weapons by Italians in East Africa, made on May 12, 1936, during a League of Nations meeting. Despite these efforts, the League's response was insufficient. Time magazine named Haile Selassie Man of the Year, though this recognition did little to change the outcome in Ethiopia. It was not progressive, as the League of Nations was unwilling to take concrete measures against Italy, which had ceased membership in the League by December 1937. In the meantime, Selassie left for England, where he lived in exile for the remainder of the 1930s. During his years of exile, the world was not without contending political forces. The state of enmity intensified after Austria and Czechoslovakia were both annexed by Germany in 1938 and 1939, respectively. The Second World War began in September 1939, with Britain and France declaring war on Germany following the Nazi occupation of Poland. At first, Mussolini cautiously avoided joining the war and waited. But after Germany's ruthless offensive during the summer of 1940 had effectively brought all of continental Western Europe under Berlin's control, Italy decided to join forces with Hitler. On June 10, 1940, they declared war against Great Britain and France, aiming to capture the southeastern part of France. This meant that the Italians and the British would come to fight in East Africa. On June 13, 1940, the Italians began the East Africa campaign by attacking British Kenya from the air. This was part of a broader strategy by Italy, which aimed at conquering British territories in Egypt and Sudan, so as to join Italian East Africa with the territories of North Africa that Italy was then campaigning to expand. At first, the wars favored Mussolini, but the weaknesses of the Italian military became glaring by early 1941. The crossing of the Sahara Desert by the Italians began to stagnate, and by early 1941, Mussolini influenced Hitler to intervene. In March of that year, Mussolini sent in the retinue of the German invasion forces under the able General Erwin Rommel, known as the Afrika Korps, to North Africa, without providing any military assistance to back up the Italian position in East Africa. As a result, the British eventually managed to turn the tide in 1941, advancing into Ethiopia and Eritrea after pushing back the Italians, who had made earlier forays into Sudan and Kenya. Selassie departed from Britain and returned to the Horn of Africa, where he waged part of the war to wrest his nation back from Italian control. This conflict involved a wide array of forces, ranging from British to Ethiopian, Eritrean, Free French, and Free Belgian forces. More importantly, they wielded much stronger naval power, and a naval campaign in the Red Sea successfully created the Eritrean Front by the beginning of 1941. Accordingly, the forces of Mussolini's regime, virtually surrounded in East Africa, received no significant reinforcements, and by the end of spring 1941, the Italian defense was collapsing on all fronts. Finally, in a melee carefully choreographed 5 years after Badoglio and his Italians had occupied the city, Selassie returned and liberated Addis Ababa from the ruthless clutches of Italian colonialism. Following the defeat of the Italians and the subsequent restoration of Emperor Haile Selassie, the British were adamant that the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia would not be fully restored unless slavery was entirely abolished in the country. In the 1850s, there was a need to put an end to the slave trade across Africa. This was due to Great Britain's position and supremacy as a powerful nation for much of the 19th century. However, slavery was still prevalent in Ethiopia in 1935 when the Second Italo-Ethiopian War began. The situation had further deteriorated during the reign of Emperor Menelik II and the regency of Haile Selassie in the 1920s. Following the annexation, the Italians announced that slavery would be outlawed. This was ironic, given that Italy was committing acts of genocide in another African territory, and even more so as its German allies were about to employ the slave labor of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Czechs, Russians, and various other nationalities within Central and Eastern Europe to wage war. The British cabinet informed Selassie upon his restoration that merely abolishing slavery was not enough, and that decisive measures needed to be taken for its real implementation. In 1942, the emperor issued a proclamation outlawing slavery in Ethiopia. Even though the Allies scored a significant victory in 1941 with the East Africa Campaign, Ethiopia and its allies in the Second World War were not free from the Nazis until 4 years later. When this happened, the United Nations replaced the League of Nations, with Ethiopia joining the UN in 1948. In the aftermath of the war and the settlement of the East African territories, Selassie benefited Ethiopia, where the Ogaden was partitioned between the Italians, British, and Abyssinia. Selassie's priority throughout these years was to maintain the modernization of his country. Although the aristocracy and the clergy had reached great heights in the 1920s and 1930s, there were still formidable forces that wanted to ensure that changes did not happen too much or too quickly. However, by the mid-1940s, with the war nearing an end, Selassie was more than ready to hasten the pace of change. Ultimately, a new constitution was issued in 1955. It amended the 1931 Constitution and incorporated aspects of the United States Constitution. Nevertheless, under Selassie's leadership after the war, Ethiopia did not develop into a Western-style democracy. Instead, the election of the people's representatives in parliament was limited to the feudal elite and other powerful interests. Many issues were hotly debated in Ethiopia in the post-war years, especially in the 1950s. One of the most pressing was Eritrea, a former Italian territory. After the successful conclusion of the East Africa Campaign in 1941, the tiny northern nation of Ethiopia was put under British control. Despite most of Eritrea's western section being incorporated into British Sudan, the Allied nations backed Ethiopia's claim over Eritrea after the conflict. When Eritrea's British administration ended in the early 1950s, Ethiopia incorporated Eritrea into a federal system, granting the region the right to self-govern under its own administration, with certain levels of self-rule. In contrast, Selassie sought greater control over Eritrea, which gave Ethiopia access to the Red Sea. In 1962, he achieved that goal by dissolving Eritrea's autonomous parliament and fully incorporating the territory into Ethiopia. By this time, a movement seeking independence, called the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, had already begun fighting back against the Ethiopian government. Over the next 3 decades, the ELF and other liberation groups continued radical movements, often fighting among themselves. The conflict soon became an extension of the Cold War, as the factions began courting the Soviet Union, Cuba, and others for weapons. Besides the Eritrean struggle for independence, Emperor Selassie's government had to confront numerous other conflicts. Political conflicts increased in the 1950s and 1960s, even more so than ethnic ones. Ethiopia has more than 80 ethnic groups, and with this diversity comes ethnic-related problems. Ethnic groups, especially the Oromo and Amhara, which together make up more than half of Ethiopia's population, could not reconcile with the country's administration since the empire had been built through conquests spanning centuries. Selassie was ethnically Oromo. He and the Ethiopian government held the mission of solving this challenge through ethnic federalism, which aimed to organize Ethiopian society into about 13 ethnic enclaves after the war. This approach caused many Oromos, Amharas, Tigrayans, Somalis, and others to cling to their ethnic identities instead of uniting as Ethiopians. This created new tensions rather than addressing the existing ones. These issues may have escalated over the years and may have contributed to the delay in the country's development during Selassie's reign. Among all the ethnic groups of Ethiopia, the Tigrayans, who made up about 7 or 8% of the population and were concentrated in the Tigray province in the north, were the ones who found the government most uninviting. In the 1950s, the imperial government showed open hostility toward the Tigrayans and neglected the province. There were already signs of strain on its resources, and the danger of famine loomed, exacerbated by destructive invasions. Within this time frame, severe droughts, locusts, and devastating diseases like typhus, smallpox, and other equally lethal illnesses compromised agricultural output and contributed to famine. When famine struck Tigray in 1958, the central government in Addis Ababa did little to mitigate the crisis, which claimed tens of thousands of lives. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration in 1959 became more overtly involved in restoring Haile Selassie's regime and provided significant military assistance to Ethiopia. Nevertheless, the death toll in Tigray and its neighboring regions exceeded 100,000 by the time the famine reached its worst in 1961, and even the mid-60s saw another famine in northern Ethiopia. Despite internal issues, such as the Eritrean War of Independence, the Tigrayan famine, and ethnocentrism within the Ethiopian Empire, Selassie continued to maintain an image of a powerful leader on the international stage. As one of the longest-serving heads of state in history, he enjoyed superiority at various international events, including the memorial service for the late President John F. Kennedy in Washington, D.C. in 1963, and the memorial for Charles de Gaulle, then President of France, in 1970. Furthermore, during the early 1960s, Ethiopian peacekeeping forces were deployed to various hotspots, including the Congo and other regions. Ethiopia also managed to gain recognition among the countries in the non-aligned movement, which refused to side with either the Warsaw Pact or NATO. Selassie was also instrumental in the politics of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the most remarkable achievements of his political career was his role in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, which later became the framework for the African Union. During his reign, the headquarters of the OAU were also located in Addis Ababa. During his post-World War II reign, Selassie continued to maintain his formidable stature on the international stage, emerging as a widely accepted charismatic leader. In the 1930s, a new quasi-religion and social movement called Ethiopianism started, inspired by Christian worship and the Back to Africa movement, which advocated for people of African descent in the Americas to return to Africa as slavery was coming to an end. The Rastafari movement, which arose in the Caribbean and drew from Ethiopianism, began in the 1930s. It was named after Ras Tafari, the title Selassie, held as regent in the 1920s. This movement proclaimed Selassie as their god, believing he was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The movement gained momentum, particularly in Jamaica during the 1950s, where many who had never been to Ethiopia developed a deep interest in Selassie. While there is no evidence that Selassie actively sought to prevent such veneration, he did not seek to be recognized as a prophetic messiah within the Rastafarian religion. Nonetheless, Rastafarianism spread, with Selassie viewed as a divine figure. Domestically, however, Haile Selassie allowed the development of a dictatorial regime in Ethiopia, in stark contrast to the almost divine adoration he received from the Rastafarian community. By the last 20 years of his reign, the country had developed into a police state. On the other hand, Selassie had understandable reasons to worry about the security of his position. A faction of the Keburabazega imperial bodyguard attempted a coup d'état in Ethiopia in 1960, while the emperor was in Brazil on official duty. The Niue brothers, Germame and Mengistu, led the insurrectionists and proclaimed Crown Prince Asfaw Wasson as the new emperor who would succeed Haile Selassie. The Crown Prince was placed under house arrest. However, it remains unclear whether he had any participation in the coup. The insurrection against the emperor's reign was quelled nonetheless, and the coup leaders were arrested after 4 days of violence in December around Addis Ababa, resulting in more than 300 fatalities. Yet, the unsuccessful coup in 1960 significantly contributed to the factors that brought about Selassie's increasingly authoritarian and repressive regime in Ethiopia throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The Ethiopian political system became more and more dictatorial, violating basic human rights. On the whole, the 1960s was a period of heavy government repression of dissent against Selassie's regime, especially with the internment of many individuals and the disappearance of political adversaries. As student agitation increased, some factions embraced communism. Criticisms of the regime and Selassie himself mounted in the 1960s, and strict limitations were placed on journalism. In addition, the Eritrean conflict, which was characterized by war crimes against civilians by the Imperial Ethiopian Army by the late 1960s, exacerbated the situation. For instance, Selassie's troops killed approximately 800 residents of Ona village when they attacked the region in December 1970. Similarly, in July 1967, Ethiopian troops killed around 170 people in Hazimo. Some of these atrocities may not have been directly ordered by the state, but Selassie is ultimately at fault for igniting the Eritrean War. By the early 1970s, civil liberties groups such as Freedom House claimed that Ethiopia was on the brink of sliding into a draconian regime that engaged in gross violations of rights, despite Selassie's positive global image. By the early 1970s, large segments of the Ethiopian populace began to lose faith in Selassie's leadership and governance. While some disliked the former ruling house, Selassie still enjoyed support from established elites, such as the church and nobility, who stood to lose greatly if the imperial structure were dismantled. In 1972, the onset of a second devastating famine in Ethiopia only deepened this discontent. This time, the famine hit the northern region of Wollo, adjacent to the Tigray region. Moreover, the government's failure to take adequate measures, such as procuring more food grains and delivering them to the affected areas, worsened the drought. The quest for control over certain resources provoked ethnic conflicts among the Oromos, Afars, and Somalis. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 80,000 individuals died in the region between Wollo and its vicinity during 1972 and 1973. More alarming, rumors began to circulate that food supplies from Wollo were reaching Addis Ababa and other parts of the country at the height of the famine. Over time, the unease during Selassie's rule continued to grow. This may not have come as a shock. In 1972, worn out by conflicts within and without, struggling for power, and ruling through violence and repression, the emperor finally reached the age of 80. This was the same time the Wollo famine was taking shape. While Selassie officially became Emperor of Ethiopia in 1916, after around 10 years as regent and a break between 1936 and 1941, he had held one form of leadership for more than half a century. In January 1974, soldiers stationed near the town of Negele Barana began to show signs of discontent and restlessness. They mutinied, citing reasons such as poor hygiene, low wages, and poor housing. They captured one of their superior commanders, Lieutenant General Derese Dubal, and enacted a dramatic scene, forcing the general to drink the same contaminated water they had been drinking. Many, especially those disillusioned with the rigid social order under Selassie's regime, resonated with this revolt. Fearing the spread of rebellion, unrest and protest began to intensify throughout the country in early February. These protests were well organized and joined by a significant number of rank-and-file police and army officers. For Selassie, the news was terrible, as it must be for all authoritarian leaders who can only command respect, while there are loyal military and police forces willing to obey. By early March, there was so much pressure on the emperor that he was forced to proclaim his willingness to make dignified compromises, to control the ministers and other members of government within the parliament. Most importantly, there was an attempt to revise the 1955 Constitution in order to reflect the heterogeneous ethnicities of the imperial structure. Yet the eruption of hostilities did not cease, even with those steps. Alternatively, in March 1974, the federations of labor unions called for nationwide labor activism and strikes. In the first weeks of April, the large Muslim population in the country began a campaign for more religious liberties. At that time, it was becoming evident to Emperor Selassie that he was losing control, as the military was already exercising civil authority over a good number of government activities. However, it was in June that the more infamous Derg made its appearance. Essentially taking over during the summer of 1974, this group of army officers and lower-ranking officials became known as the Provisional Military Administrative Council. They issued a manifesto for reform and proceeded to place prominent politicians under arrest on the grounds of political agitation. Ultimately, on September 12, 1974, the Derg regime removed His Imperial Majesty from power. Eerily, 44 years after his coronation and over 60 years in politics for the once young prince turned emperor. Having provided a testamur, Selassie was confined to his home. This was also proclaimed by the Derg, who had previously crowned Asfa Wasson, the son of Empress Menon, who was based outside the country. They ordered him to return to Ethiopia for his crowning, but he insisted that the proclamations for his father's removal and his own crowning as emperor by the Provisional Military Administrative Council were null and void. Thus, the Derg eliminated the monarchy, which had been in place since the founding of the Ethiopian Empire. In March 1975, they officially marked the end of the empire and began the process of building a new Ethiopian state. However, throughout 1974 and 1975, the new military regime oversaw the extermination of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals associated with the previous imperial regime. This included certain affiliate members of the imperial house, particularly Eskinder Desta, Selassie's grandson, who had also held a high rank in the Ethiopian navy. The bad news for the abdicated emperor continued for months, and on August 28, 1975, state media announced that Haile Selassie had died the previous day. Although the official cause of death for the emperor, who was 83, was stated as respiratory failure, it is widely believed that he was strangled to death by Derg soldiers. His body was buried under a concrete slab on the premises of the royal palace in Addis Ababa. It remained there until 1992, when his remains were exhumed and interred alongside those of Emperor Menelik II in Holy Trinity Cathedral, also located in Addis Ababa. By the time Haile Selassie was killed, Ethiopia was already in the depths of a civil conflict that would drag on until the early 1990s. In the middle of the 1970s, the Derg attempted to expand the borders of Ethiopia and called for assistance from the Soviet Union with the aim of preventing the spread of capitalistic practices, claiming to practice Marxist-Leninism. Major counter-revolutionary participants included the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. The desire to see Eritrea as a sovereign state was one of the major factors that contributed to an already strained relationship between Ethiopia and Somalia, which had begun going south since the year 1977, particularly in the squawking Ogaden region. Because of such political inquiries, questions, and struggles claim, the death toll that arose from the Red Terror lodges of the Derg regime in late 1970s is in the tens of thousands. The occurrence of new famines in the 1980s, most notably between 1983 and 1985, when up to 500,000 people died during the Ethiopian Civil War, added to the violent memories of the war. It wasn't until 1991 that the war finally came to an end, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been supplying arms to the Horn of Africa region. By the time the conflict concluded, nearly 1.5 million lives had been lost, claimed by the triple forces of famine, disease, and warfare. The strife lasted for several years, but 1991 brought some relief as the Ethiopian Civil War came to a halt. In the mid-1990s, a new constitution was introduced, and Eritrea, after a long struggle, finally gained independence. Following this, Ethiopia attempted to create a federal system that was ethnically based, allowing each ethnic group to govern provinces where they were the majority. However, new problems arose swiftly. In 1998, a new war with Eritrea broke out. Though the main hostilities ceased in 2000, border conflicts and tensions continued to simmer in northern Ethiopia. In general, the federalism system has struggled against Ethiopia's complex ethnic composition. As a result, ethnic conflict resolution has largely failed. More recently, international scrutiny has focused on the Ethiopian government's mistreatment of the Tigray minority in the north, a remnant of policies from the era of Haile Selassie. By the end of 2022, Ethiopia's federal government effectively declared a state of war against Tigray. Politics in the modern age could not escape from these abuses, where accusations of warfare crimes and mass starvation turned to be also elements rampant in events that many have referred to as genocidal actions. The conflict started in 2020 and still remains a formidable danger to Ethiopia's growing geopolitical aspirations as East Africa's next economic and political powerhouse. Let us now revert back again to the anthropological interest in the towering historical presence of the figure Haile Selassie. The 1930s saw him as a powerful figure in causing resistance against the Italian incursion and occupation of Ethiopia. In the interim, he adopted the language of more than just a leader. The rise of Haile Selassie did not wait until he was declared king, for he started a process to transform Ethiopia's pitiful state. With regard to Haile Selassie, his global engagements became more of an independent enterprise in the years after the Second World War. Of course, his reputation as a political leader grew also due to his anti-slavery campaign in Ethiopia. Yet this does not account for the majority of his biography, because most of it deals with the fact that every Rastafarian regards him as a god in some peculiar way. By the same token, it should not be forgotten that Haile Selassie was a great deal able to rise above. Of course, his time saw many abuses of human rights, and his rule turned out to be more and more dictatorial. These factors brought about the revolution that eventually ended his rule. Additionally, his poor handling of the Eritrea issue resulted in a war that lasted for decades, even beyond his death. Perhaps the greatest failure of Haile Selassie was his inability to bridge the ethnic and religious divides within Ethiopia during his long reign, over 50 years as both regent and emperor. This lack of uniting all sections of a country towards a common identity has remained a scar on the fabric of Ethiopian and the greater Horn of Africa today. In conclusion, with respect to Haile Selassie's legacy, would you say that the feelings of affection towards Haile Selassie, as well as the so-called justifications for the Italians' overthrow, were overly unreasonable? Many thanks for taking your time to watch this. You are welcome to express your opinions in the comments section below.